The morning mist clung to the Afghan mountains like a shroud, masking the deadly game of cat and mouse that was about to unfold. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez pressed her eye to the scope of her Barrett M82 sniper rifle, scanning the treacherous terrain that stretched endlessly before her. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most precise marksmen in the U.S. military, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for what was coming in the next 72 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The date was September 15th, 2011, and Operation Silent Thunder was supposed to be routine, if anything involving Navy SEALs deep behind enemy lines could ever be called routine. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target, Taliban commander Abdul Rahman, was holed up in a compound roughly 8 miles northeast of Forward Operating Base Chapman. What the intelligence didn't reveal was that Rahman had been expecting them, and he had prepared a trap that would test every ounce of training, courage, and skill that Maria and her brothers-in-arms possessed. Maria had grown up in El Paso, Texas, where her father, a Vietnam veteran, taught her to shoot cans off of fence posts with an old .22 rifle when she was just 7 years old. "Mija," he would say, his weathered hands guiding her small fingers, "shooting isn't about the gun. It's about breathing, patience, and knowing yourself better than your enemy knows you." Those words would echo in her mind as she lay prone on that rocky outcropping, nearly 2 decades later, watching through her scope as SEAL Team 6 moved like ghosts through the valley below. The team consisted of 8 of the Navy's finest: Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison, the team leader whose calm demeanor masked a warrior's heart; Petty Officer First Class Tommy Tank Rodriguez, the team's breacher whose massive frame could punch through any door; Chief Petty Officer Marcus Ghost Williams, their communications specialist who could make radios work in conditions that would stump NASA engineers; and 5 other operators whose names were classified but whose skills were legendary. Each man had volunteered for this mission, knowing the risks, understanding that they might not come home. But Maria wasn't supposed to be there at all. Originally assigned to provide overwatch for a different operation, she had been reassigned at the last minute when their primary sniper developed appendicitis. The team had barely met her before insertion, and she could feel their skepticism. Not because she was a woman, these were professionals who had worked with female operators before. But trust in their world wasn't given freely. It was earned through blood, sweat, and proven competence under fire. The helicopter insertion had gone flawlessly. 2 military Hawks had swept in low, using the mountainous terrain to mask their approach. Maria had fast-roped to her overwatch position while the SEALs dropped into the valley below. Her job was simple in concept, but brutally demanding in execution. Provide early warning of enemy movement, eliminate high-value targets of opportunity, and be ready to provide covering fire if the mission went sideways. As she settled into position, adjusting her bipod and checking her range cards for the 100th time, Maria felt the familiar calm that always preceded action. Her father had called it the zone, that mental space where everything slowed down, where wind speed became a whispered conversation, where the distance between crosshairs and target became as intimate as a handshake. She had first experienced it during her second deployment in Iraq, when she had made an impossible shot to save a convoy under ambush. The memory of that moment had carried her through sniper school, through the grueling selection process for special operations support, and through every mission since. The target compound sat in a natural depression surrounded by terraced fields that had been abandoned years ago when the fighting grew too intense. Ancient irrigation channels crisscrossed the area, providing natural concealment but also creating a maze that could hide defenders. Through her scope, she could see the SEALs moving with practiced precision, each man knowing exactly where his teammates were, their movements choreographed through countless hours of training. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice crackled softly through her earpiece. "Overwatch. We have eyes on the compound. No movement visible. Beginning approach in 30 seconds. Maria swept her scope across the ridgelines, looking for the telltale glint of enemy optics, the unnatural shadow that might hide a sniper, the slight movement that would betray an ambush position. Everything looked clear, but something felt wrong. Call it intuition, call it experience, but every instinct she had developed through 4 combat deployments was screaming at her. The first shots came from everywhere at once. The valley erupted in a symphony of death as muzzle flashes sparked from positions that Maria's trained eye had somehow missed. The Taliban fighters had prepared their ambush with military precision, using the natural terrain and abandoned irrigation ditches to create interlocking fields of fire that turned the depression into a killing ground. The SEALs, caught in the open during their approach, immediately took cover behind whatever they could find: rocks, abandoned farming equipment, the crumbling remains of mud brick walls. Contact front, contact left, contact everywhere. Tank's voice boomed through the radio as his SAW machine gun began its deadly chatter, sending streams of 5.56 rounds toward the muzzle flashes that seemed to bloom like deadly flowers throughout the compound. But for every enemy position they suppressed, 2 more seemed to open fire. Maria quickly realized that this wasn't just an ambush. It was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to destroy an entire SEAL team. Through her scope, Maria began the deadly calculus that defined a sniper's world: range to target, 847 meters to the nearest confirmed enemy position. Wind speed, gusting from the southwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. Elevation difference, she was approximately 200 feet above the valley floor. Temperature, the rising sun was beginning to create heat mirages that would affect bullet trajectory. All of these variables had to be processed in seconds because the lives of 8 men depended on her precision. Her first shot took out a Taliban fighter who had exposed himself while trying to get a better angle on Ghost's position. The Barrett's .50 caliber round covered the distance in just over a second, and Maria watched through her scope as the enemy fighter simply disappeared from view. 1 down, but how many more were there? The muzzle flashes suggested at least 20 fighters, possibly more hidden in positions she couldn't see from her current angle. Overwatch, we need immediate suppression on the ridgeline to our north. We have at least 6 fighters with RPGs up there, and they're bracketing our position. Maria swung her rifle toward the indicated position and immediately spotted the threat. 3 men were setting up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher while others provided security. She had maybe 10 seconds before they fired. Her second shot eliminated the RPG gunner, sending the rocket launcher tumbling down the rocky slope. But his loader immediately grabbed the weapon, and Maria knew she needed to work faster. The Barrett was an incredibly accurate rifle, but it wasn't built for rapid follow-up shots. Each round had to be chambered manually, and the massive recoil meant she had to reacquire her target after every shot. It was precision over speed, but right now, the SEALs needed both. Overwatch, we need immediate suppression on the ridgeline to our north. We have at least 6 fighters with RPGs up there, and they're bracketing our position. Maria swung her rifle toward the indicated position and immediately spotted the threat. 3 men were setting up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, while others provided security. She had maybe 10 seconds before they fired. Her third shot took out another enemy fighter who was trying to flank the SEAL position from the east. Through her scope, she could see Tank laying down suppressive fire with his machine gun, while Rodriguez worked to clear a malfunction in his rifle. These were America's finest warriors, but they were still just 8 men against overwhelming odds. And now she was the only thing standing between them and complete annihilation. The Taliban commander, whoever he was, had clearly studied American tactics. The ambush positions were perfectly placed to force the SEALs into a defensive circle, where they would eventually be overwhelmed by superior numbers. But he had made one critical mistake. He hadn't accounted for a sniper, with Maria's skill positioned on the high ground with a clear field of fire.
Her fourth shot eliminated a machine gunner who had been pouring fire into the SEALs' position from the main building. The heavy weapon fell silent, giving the team a momentary respite. But Maria could see movement in other buildings, and she realized with growing concern that the Taliban had prepared secondary and tertiary positions throughout the entire area. "Overwatch, we're taking casualties," Morrison's voice carried a new urgency. "Tank is hit, but still fighting. We need to move to alternate positions, but they've got us pinned down from multiple directions." Maria could see the truth of his words through her scope. The SEALs were trapped in what the military called a fatal funnel, a position where movement in any direction would expose them to devastating enemy fire. That's when she saw him, a figure moving between buildings with the confidence of a commander. Through her scope, she could make out enough detail to realize this had to be someone important. He was directing the other fighters, pointing towards SEAL positions, coordinating the attack with hand signals. This wasn't just another Taliban fighter. This was likely the high-value target they had come to capture, Abdul Rahman himself.
The range was nearly 1,000 meters, and he was only partially visible behind a low wall. It would be an extremely difficult shot under the best circumstances, but these were far from the best circumstances. Her position was becoming known to the enemy. She had already seen several fighters trying to locate her by following her bullet trails back to their source. Soon, they would start directing fire toward her position, and she would lose the advantage of surprise. Maria steadied her breathing and began the mental calculations for what could be the most important shot of her career. The distance to the Taliban commander was 987 meters, nearly a kilometer of space where wind, gravity, and a dozen other factors would try to push her bullet off course. She adjusted her scope for the range, factoring in the elevation difference and the crosswind that had picked up as the morning sun heated the valley floor. Through her earpiece, she could hear the SEAL's situation deteriorating rapidly. Tank's machine gun had fallen silent. Whether from his wounds or mechanical failure, she couldn't tell. Ghost was reporting critically low ammunition across the team, and she could hear the distinctive crack thump of incoming sniper fire. The Taliban weren't just using small arms anymore. They had brought in precision shooters of their own. "I've got movement on the ridgeline to the west," she reported into her radio, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding below. "Looks like enemy sniper teams moving into position. You're about to have incoming precision fire." Even as she spoke, she was already swinging her rifle toward the new threat. A sniper duel was something she had trained for, but hoped she would never experience. The first enemy sniper shot cracked past her position, close enough that she could feel the supersonic shockwave. They had her general location, but not her exact position, yet. She had maybe minutes before they bracketed her location and made her position untenable. Every second counted now, and she had to choose between eliminating the enemy commander or dealing with the immediate sniper threat. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "When everything's on the line, Miha, trust your training and take the shot that matters most." The Taliban commander was still partially visible behind his cover, still coordinating the attack that was slowly destroying the SEAL team. If she could eliminate him, the entire enemy attack might lose coordination. But if she missed, or if the enemy snipers found her first, 8 American warriors would die in this forgotten valley in Afghanistan. She made her choice. The Barrett bucked against her shoulder as she squeezed the trigger, the massive .50 caliber round racing across nearly a kilometer of hostile territory. Through her scope, she watched as the Taliban commander spun and fell, her bullet having found its mark despite the impossible distance in adverse conditions. But there was no time to celebrate. Muzzle flashes were already sparking from the enemy sniper positions, and she could hear bullets snapping overhead. "Tango down," she reported calmly, already moving to a new position. "I got their commander, but we've got bigger problems. Enemy precision shooters are bracketing my position and they're getting close." She low-crawled along the ridgeline, dragging her rifle and equipment to a new firing position 30 meters away. The movement probably saved her life. Seconds after she vacated her old position, she heard the distinctive sound of a heavy rifle impact exactly where she had been lying. The death of their commander seemed to have the effect Maria had hoped for. The coordinated enemy fire became sporadic, with individual fighters taking independent action rather than following a unified plan. But there were still too many of them,
and the SEALs were still trapped in their increasingly precarious position. "Overwatch, we're down to our last magazines," Morrison reported, his voice carrying the weight of a commander who was running out of options. "Ghost is working on alternate extraction, but we need more time than we've got." Translation? They were about to die unless something changed dramatically. That's when Maria heard something that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds. The Taliban had brought in indirect fire weapons, and the first rounds were already falling around the SEAL's position. She could see the smoke and debris through her scope as explosions walked closer to the team's location. Mortars were area weapons. Precision didn't matter when you could simply saturate an entire grid square with high explosives. "Mortars incoming!" she shouted into her radio, though she knew the SEALs had already figured that out. Through her scope, she could see them trying to move to more defensible positions, but every direction offered nothing but open ground covered by enemy fire. They were caught between the proverbial rock and hard place, stay where they were and get killed by mortars, or move and get killed by small arms fire. The second enemy sniper shot struck the rock inches from her head, showering her with granite fragments. They were getting closer, and she realized with crystal clarity that she was probably going to die on this nameless mountain in Afghanistan. But if she was going to die, she was going to take as many of the enemy with her as possible, and she was going to give those 8 American warriors every chance she could provide. Her next shot eliminated one of the mortar crew members, but she could see others moving to take his place. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. There were more enemy fighters than I had bullets, and more targets than I had time to engage before their return fire found her. This is what soldiers called a target-rich environment, and it was about to become her tomb. But Maria Vasquez hadn't survived 4 combat deployments by giving up when things looked hopeless. She had survived by being smarter, more determined, and more skilled than anyone who wanted to kill her. And she was about to prove that one well-trained American sniper could change the entire course of a battle. The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat that would turn the rocky outcropping into an oven. But Maria barely noticed the temperature as she continued her deadly work. Her 5th shot took out the mortar team's forward observer, the man with the radio who was calling in corrections for the indirect fire. Without him, the mortars would have to fire blind, significantly reducing their accuracy. It wasn't much of an advantage, but in their current situation, any advantage might mean the difference between life and death. Through her scope, she could see the SEALs using the brief lull in coordinated fire to improve their positions. Rodriguez had found a depression that offered better cover, while Williams was working frantically with his radio equipment, trying to establish communications with any friendly forces in the area. But Maria knew that help was still at least 15 minutes away, and 15 minutes was a lifetime in combat. Her 6th shot shattered another Taliban fighter who was attempting to move a machine gun to a position where he could enfilade the SEAL's defensive line. The Barrett's massive bullet didn't just neutralize the threat, it destroyed the weapon as well, the .50 caliber round tearing through both the fighter and his machine gun in a spray of metal and flesh. But even as she celebrated the small victory, she could see more enemy fighters moving through the compound's maze of buildings and trenches. The enemy snipers were getting closer to finding her exact position. She could hear their bullets striking rocks all around her hide site, the distinctive crack-thump sound of supersonic rounds passing overhead. Professional snipers worked in teams. One would spot while the other fired. Then they would switch roles. This allowed them to maintain almost constant observation while methodically zeroing in on her location. She estimated they would have her exact position within the next few shots. "Overwatch, we're about to try moving to that stone wall about 50 meters to our north." Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Can you provide suppression on the compound's main building? We're taking the heaviest fire from there." Maria immediately swung her scope toward the indicated target. Through the magnified optics, she could see multiple muzzle flashes coming from windows and doorways. Too many targets for one sniper, but she could at least make them think twice about maintaining their current rate of fire.
Her seventh shot shattered a window frame just as an enemy fighter was taking aim at the moving SEALs. The psychological effect was immediate. The enemy fire from that building slackened as fighters dove for better cover. Fear was as effective a weapon as bullets sometimes, and the knowledge that a precision shooter was watching their every move would make even experienced fighters more cautious. But caution worked both ways, and Maria knew she was reaching the limits of what one sniper could accomplish against such overwhelming odds. She had maybe 10 rounds left in her current magazine, with 2 more magazines in her pack. After that, she would be down to her sidearm and whatever ammunition she could scavenge from enemy positions. Not exactly a comfortable margin for error. The SEALs made their move, bounding from cover to cover in pairs while their teammates provided suppressive fire. It was a textbook movement under fire, executed with the precision that only came from countless hours of training and absolute trust in each other. But even textbook movements could fail when the enemy had overwhelming numbers and advantageous positions. Maria's 8th shot took down a Taliban fighter who had gotten a clear shot at Rodriguez during his movement. She watched through her scope as the SEAL dove behind the stone wall, just seconds before enemy rounds chewed up the ground where he had been lying. Close, too close. They were all operating on borrowed time now. Movement to the south, she reported, tracking new threats through her scope. Looks like reinforcements, at least a squad-sized element moving up the valley. This was what she had been dreading. The Taliban weren't just defending a position, they were reinforcing it. More fighters meant more weapons, more angles of attack, and less chance that the SEALs would survive long enough for air support to arrive. The enemy sniper's bullet struck the rock directly in front of her scope, the impact sending granite chips into her face and cracking her scope's objective lens. That had been close, inches from taking her head off. She immediately rolled to her left, knowing that the next shot would be even more accurate. Her scope was damaged but still functional, though the cracked lens would make precision shooting at extreme ranges nearly impossible. Her 9th shot was fired almost instinctively as she rolled, aimed at one of the enemy's sniper positions based on her memory of where the muzzle flash had originated. Through her damage scope, she couldn't tell if she had hit anything, but the return fire from that direction stopped abruptly. Either she had scored a hit, or they were repositioning for a better shot. Neither option was particularly comforting. Air support inbound 8 minutes. Ghost's voice carried the first good news they had heard all morning. 8 minutes. Still an eternity, but it was hope. The question was whether they could hold out that long and whether Maria could keep the enemy from overrunning the SEALs' position before the cavalry arrived.
The reinforcing Taliban fighters were moving with discipline and purpose, and Maria realized with growing alarm that these weren't the same irregulars they had been fighting. These new arrivals moved with military precision, using proper bounding overwatch techniques and maintaining tactical spacing. Someone had sent professional fighters to finish what the ambush had started. Her 10th shot targeted the apparent leader of the reinforcement element, a man who was directing the others with hand signals and positioning them for what looked like a coordinated assault on the SEAL's position. The range was extreme, nearly 1,100 meters, and with her damaged scope, she was shooting more on instinct and experience than precise calculation. The bullet struck low and to the right, missing the leader but eliminating one of his subordinates. Close enough to make them all dive for cover, buying precious seconds for the increasingly desperate SEALs below. "They're setting up for a final push," Morrison reported, his voice steady despite their dire circumstances. "I count at least 30 fighters moving into assault positions. We're going to need every round to count." Maria could see what he meant through her scope. The Taliban weren't content to simply pin down the Americans until they ran out of ammunition. They were preparing to overwhelm the position with a human wave attack that would cost them casualties but would guarantee success. Her 11th shot took out a machine gunner who was setting up to provide covering fire for the assault. But even as she worked the Barrett's bolt to chamber another round, she could see 2 more fighters dragging the weapon to a new position. They had more men than she had bullets, and they knew it. This wasn't going to be decided by marksmanship alone. The Taliban began their assault with a barrage of rocket-propelled grenades. Maria watched through her scope as the crude but effective weapons arced through the air toward the SEAL's position. The explosions shook the ground even from her position hundreds of meters away, and she could only imagine what the concussion was doing to the men taking cover behind rocks and low walls below. "RPGs incoming," she shouted into her radio, though the warning came seconds after the weapons had already impacted. Through the smoke and debris, she could see that the stone wall the SEALs had been using for cover was partially collapsed. Worse, she couldn't immediately see all 8 team members through the dust and confusion. Her 12th shot eliminated the RPG gunner who was preparing to fire a second round, but she knew it was too little too late. The assault was beginning in earnest now, with Taliban fighters rising from concealed positions throughout the compound and beginning their charge toward the American position. She had never felt so helpless watching through a magnified scope as brave men faced overwhelming odds. "Tanks down hard," Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, tight with stress and suppressed emotion. "Ghost is unconscious but breathing. We're down to 4 effective fighters." Half the team was combat ineffective, ammunition was critically low, and air support was still minutes away. The mathematics of survival had decisively shifted in favor of the enemy. But Maria hadn't survived 4 combat deployments by accepting defeat when the odds were against her. She had survived by finding ways to change those odds, even when change seemed impossible. And right now, she was the only variable in this equation that the enemy hadn't fully accounted for. Her 13th shot took down the lead Taliban fighter in the assault, sending the others diving for whatever cover they could find in the open ground between the compound and the SEALs' position. But they were too many of them, and they had too much momentum. Within seconds, they were up and moving again, their war cries echoing off the valley walls as they charged toward what they believed would be an easy victory. That's when Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of continuing to pick off individual targets from her concealed position, she stood up, exposing herself completely to enemy fire, and began engaging targets as fast as she could work the Barrett's bolt. She was abandoning precision for volume of fire, trading her own safety for the lives of 8 men she barely knew but would die to protect. Her 14th shot stopped a fighter who was almost on top of the SEAL's position. Her 15th took down another who was preparing to throw a grenade. The enemy return fire was immediate and intense. Bullets snapped past her head, struck the rocks around her feet, tugged at her equipment. But she kept firing, kept working the bolt, kept sending .5 caliber death downrange at any enemy fighter she could see through her cracked scope. "What the hell are you doing up there?" Morrison's voice carried concern along with gratitude. "Get down before they kill you." But Maria knew that getting down now would mean the death of every American in that valley. She had committed to this course of action, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited her. Her 13th shot eliminated another fighter, but she was down to her last magazine now. 16 rounds between her and whatever final chapter was about to be written in this forgotten corner of Afghanistan. The Taliban charging fighters had realized where the devastating sniper fire was coming from, and they were beginning to direct their fire toward her position. The rocky outcropping that had provided such excellent cover was now becoming her execution platform. But in the distance, she could finally hear the sound that both she and the SEALs had been praying for, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors and the higher-pitched whine of attack aircraft engines. Air support was almost in range, but almost wasn't good enough when enemy fighters were literally meters away from overrunning the SEAL position. The first Apache attack helicopter crested the ridgeline like an avenging angel, its 30mm chain gun already spinning up to firing speed. But the Taliban assault was seconds away from success, and Maria knew that the aircraft needed time to identify friendly versus enemy positions before they could engage. Time that the SEALs simply didn't have. Her 17th shot dropped a Taliban fighter who was pulling the pin on a grenade just meters from Rodriguez's position. The range was so close that she could see the man's face through her damaged scope, could see the hatred and fanaticism that had driven him to this remote valley to kill Americans. The grenade rolled away from the SEAL's position and exploded harmlessly against a rock, but Maria knew that luck wouldn't hold much longer. The Apache pilot's voice crackled across the radio frequency. "Groundhog 6, this is Reaper 2-1. We have visual on your position but cannot distinguish friendly from enemy. Need you to mark your location for danger close fire support."
The problem with close air support was that it required precise coordination to avoid killing the people you were trying to save. Right now, friends and enemies were so close together that any mistake would be catastrophic. "Smoke out!" Morrison shouted, and Maria watched through her scope as purple smoke began billowing from the SEALs' position. The colored smoke would mark their location for the aircraft, but it would also serve as a beacon for every enemy fighter in the area. It was a desperate gamble, but they were beyond the point where safe options existed. Her 18th shot dropped a Taliban fighter who was pulling the pin on a grenade just meters from Rodriguez's position. The range was so close that she could see the man's face through her damaged scope, could see the hatred and fanaticism that had driven him to this remote valley to kill Americans. The grenade rolled away from the SEAL's position and exploded harmlessly against a rock, but Maria knew that luck wouldn't hold much longer. The Apache pilot's voice crackled across the radio frequency. "Groundhog 6, this is Reaper 2-1. We have visual on your position but cannot distinguish friendly from enemy. Need you to mark your location for danger close fire support." The problem with close air support was that it required precise coordination to avoid killing the people you were trying to save. Right now, friends and enemies were so close together that any mistake would be catastrophic. "Smoke out!" Morrison shouted, and Maria watched through her scope as purple smoke began billowing from the SEALs' position. The colored smoke would mark their location for the aircraft, but it would also serve as a beacon for every enemy fighter in the area. It was a desperate gamble, but they were beyond the point where safe options existed. Her 18th shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was moving to flank the SEAL position from the west. But even as she worked the bolt to chamber another round, she could see that her intervention was having only a marginal effect. There were simply too many enemy fighters, and they were too close to the Americans for the helicopters to engage effectively without risking friendly fire casualties. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. A small building on the compound's northeastern edge that she hadn't paid attention to before. Through her scope, she could see radio antennas sprouting from its roof, and there was a steady stream of fighters moving in and out of the structure. It wasn't just another fighting position, it was the enemy's command post. If she could neutralize whatever was in that building, she might be able to disrupt the entire Taliban operation. But the building was nearly 1,200 meters away, and her scope was damaged. Worse, she would have to expose herself completely to enemy fire for the time it took to engage the target. The Taliban fighters who had been directing fire at her position would have a clear shot, and at that range, even a near miss could be fatal. Her 19th shot was aimed at what looked like a radio operator entering the command post building. The bullet struck the door frame just as the man ducked inside. A miss, but close enough to confirm that the range was at the very edge of her capability with the damaged scope. She had maybe 3 rounds left before she would need to reload, and reloading would take precious seconds she might not have. The Apache helicopters were circling now, their pilots desperately trying to find safe angles of attack that wouldn't endanger the SEALs. But the Taliban had chosen their ambush site well. The terrain and the proximity of fighters to the American position made close air support almost impossible without acceptable risk. "Overwatch, we're about to be overrun." Morrison's voice carried the calm acceptance of a professional warrior who had done everything possible and was preparing for whatever came next. "It's been an honor working with you. Tell our families." His transmission was cut off by the sound of gunfire and explosions from the valley floor. Maria's 20th shot, her last before reloading, took down another fighter, but she could see at least 6 more moving in on the SEAL's position. They were out of time, out of options, and almost out of hope. The mathematics of combat had finally caught up with them, and no amount of skill or courage could change the simple fact that 8 men, no matter how well trained, could not indefinitely hold off 30 or 40 determined attackers. But Maria Vasquez had not come this far to watch good men die because she wasn't willing to take the ultimate risk. As she fumbled for her last magazine, a plan formed in her mind. Desperate, probably suicidal, but offering the only chance she could see for those 8 SEALs to make it home alive. Instead of reloading her rifle, she reached for the radio handset clipped to her equipment harness.
The Apache pilots were still circling, still looking for a way to provide effective support without killing friendlies. What they needed was someone to guide their fire, someone who could identify targets and confirm that friendly forces were clear of the impact area. They needed a forward air controller, and Maria was about to volunteer for the most dangerous job in modern warfare. Reaper 2-1, this is Overwatch, she spoke into the radio, while enemy bullets continued to snap past her exposed position. I can provide terminal guidance for danger close missions. I have clear visual on both friendly and enemy positions. She was offering to talk the helicopters onto targets that were meters away from American forces, a job that required split-second timing and absolute precision. One mistake, one miscommunication, and she would be responsible for killing the very men she was trying to save. The Apache pilot's response was immediate. Overwatch, confirm you are qualified to provide terminal guidance for danger close engagements? In the military, qualifications mattered. Forward air controllers underwent months of specialized training, and the responsibility they carried was enormous. Lives hung in the balance of every word they spoke. Maria keyed the radio again, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. Negative on formal qualifications, but I'm the only game in town. Either we try this or 8 good men die in the next 2 minutes.
There was a moment of silence on the radio frequency, and Maria could almost feel the Apache pilot weighing his options. In the background, she could hear the increasing volume of gunfire from the valley below, punctuated by the occasional explosion of a grenade or RPG. Time was running out for everyone, and decisions had to be made based on necessity rather than regulation. "Overwatch, we're going to trust you," came the pilot's voice, carrying the weight of a man who was about to bet 8 lives on the competence of someone he had never met. "Designate your first target and confirm friendly positions are marked and clear." Maria took a deep breath and looked through her damaged scope at the chaos below. The purple smoke from the SEAL's position was still visible, but the wind was beginning to disperse it. She could see enemy fighters advancing from multiple directions, some of them already close enough to throw grenades into the Americans' defensive perimeter. This first strike had to be perfect, close enough to neutralize the immediate threat, but not so close that the blast would harm the Americans. Reaper 2-1, friendlies are marked with purple smoke approximately 50 meters southeast of the main compound building. Maria's voice was steady as she began the deadly calculus of close air support. "I have a concentration of enemy fighters in the open ground between the compound and friendly positions. Range from friendlies, approximately 30 meters. Danger close. I say again, danger close." 30 meters was incredibly close for Apache gunship fire. The 30mm high explosive rounds could cause casualties at ranges much greater than that, and the margin for error was essentially zero. But it was either risk friendly fire casualties or accept certain death for the entire SEAL team. "Overwatch, confirm danger close, 30 meters from friendlies." The pilot's voice carried the professional calm of someone who had made these kinds of shots before. "I have visual on purple smoke. Beginning attack run from the north. Keep your head down." Maria watched through her scope as the Apache banked into its attack run, the aircraft's nose dipping as the pilot lined up his shot. She could see muzzle flashes sparking from the helicopter's chin-mounted gun system, and then the distinctive sound reached her, a buzzing roar like some enormous chainsaw cutting through the morning air. The 30mm high explosive rounds impacted among the charging Taliban fighters like the fist of an angry god. Each high explosive shell was designed to defeat armored vehicles, and against unprotected human targets, the effect was devastating. Maria watched through her scope as the enemy assault simply disintegrated, fighters diving for cover or being cut down by the precision fire. "Good effect on target," she called into the radio. "Multiple enemy KIA. Assault has been broken, but I have more fighters regrouping in the compound buildings. Stand by for second target." The immediate threat had been neutralized, but there were still dozens of enemy fighters in defensive positions throughout the compound, and they would regroup quickly.
Through her scope, she could see the SEALs using the momentary lull to improve their positions and check on their wounded. Tank was moving under his own power, wounded but still in the fight. Ghost appeared to be conscious again, working frantically with his radio equipment. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in what felt like hours, they had a breathing space. Maria, Reaper 2-1. Second target is the main compound building. Multiple enemy fighters with heavy weapons in defensive positions. Friendlies are cleared to the southeast behind stone wall. You're cleared hot on the main building. The second Apache attack run came from the west, with the pilot using a different angle of approach to avoid giving the Taliban gunners a predictable target. Maria watched as rockets streaked from the helicopter's wing-mounted pods, impacting the main building in a series of explosions that sent debris flying hundreds of meters in all directions. But even as the building collapsed in a shower of mud bricks and timber, Maria could see that the fight wasn't over. Enemy fighters were streaming out of other buildings, some carrying wounded comrades, others repositioning weapons to engage the helicopters directly. The Taliban weren't finished yet, and neither was she. Multiple fighters moving to the northern compound buildings, she reported, tracking new targets through her damaged scope. They appear to be setting up anti-aircraft weapons. Recommend immediate engagement before they can engage your aircraft. Through the cracked lens, she could see men carrying what looked like heavy machine guns and possibly shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. The helicopters that had just saved the SEALs were now in danger themselves. Her 21st shot, fired from her hastily reloaded rifle, took out one of the men carrying anti-aircraft equipment. But there were others, and she was still exposed on the ridgeline, still drawing fire from multiple enemy positions. Bullets continued to snap past her position, and she knew that sooner or later one of them would find its mark. Overwatch, we have visual on the anti-aircraft threat, but we need you to stay on station for terminal guidance. Can you maintain your position? It was a polite way of asking if she was willing to keep exposing herself to enemy fire so she could continue directing the helicopter strikes. Maria keyed her radio without hesitation. Roger that, Reaper 2-1. I'm not going anywhere. It was a lie. She was going somewhere, probably to a grave on this Afghan mountainside. But those 8 SEALs needed her guidance to survive, and she would provide it for as long as she could draw breath. The third attack run targeted the northern buildings where the anti-aircraft teams were setting up. Maria watched as rockets and 30mm rounds turned the structures into rubble, eliminating the immediate threat to the helicopters. But each attack also revealed more enemy positions, more fighters who had been hiding in the compound's maze of buildings and tunnels. The Taliban weren't finished yet, and neither was she.
The battle had evolved into a deadly game of whack-a-mole, with Maria identifying targets and the Apache helicopters engaging them, only to have more enemy fighters appear from previously unknown positions. The Taliban had prepared this ambush site with multiple fallback positions, underground bunkers, and carefully camouflaged fighting holes. Every time they thought they had cleared an area, more muzzle flashes would appear from new locations. Reaper 2-1, I have movement in the eastern buildings, Maria called out her 4th target designation. Looks like they're trying to flank friendly positions from that direction. Multiple fighters with small arms and what appears to be another RPG team. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters moving with purpose through the compound's eastern section, using covered routes to avoid the helicopter's direct fire. But as she spoke into the radio, a bullet struck the rock directly beside her head, close enough that she could feel the heat from its passage. The enemy had finally gotten a precise fix on her location, and their return fire was becoming devastatingly accurate. She rolled to her left, trying to find new cover, but the ridgeline offered limited options for concealment. The 4th Apache attack run came in low and fast, rockets impacting among the eastern buildings with thunderous explosions. But even as she watched the strikes through her scope, Maria could feel her situation becoming increasingly desperate. She was running low on ammunition, her scope was damaged, and the enemy had her position bracketed. Worse, she could see that there were still substantial numbers of Taliban fighters in the compound, and they were beginning to coordinate their efforts again.
"Good hits on the eastern positions," she reported, forcing her voice to remain calm and professional. "But I'm taking increasingly accurate fire from multiple positions. I may need to relocate soon." It was military understatement. She was about to be overrun or killed in place, but she didn't want to distract the pilots with her personal problems. That's when she heard Morrison's voice over the radio. "Overwatch, this is Groundhog 6. We're going to make a break for your position. We can't leave you up there alone, and we need to consolidate our defensive position." The SEALs were proposing to leave their hard-won cover to come to her aid, a move that would expose them to enemy fire, but would also bring the team back together. "Negative, Groundhog 6, Maria replied immediately. "Your position is more defensible than mine. I'm mobile and can relocate as needed." Another lie, she wasn't mobile at all. Moving would mean abandoning her ability to provide precise terminal guidance for the helicopters, which would mean the end of effective close air support. Her 20-second shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was setting up what looked like a recoilless rifle aimed at the SEALs' position. The weapon would have been capable of penetrating their stone wall cover and killing everyone behind it. But as she worked the bolt to chamber another round, she realized she was down to less than half a magazine. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly unfavorable. "Reaper 2-1, I have what appears to be a command group in the northwestern corner of the compound. Multiple individuals with radio equipment, probably coordinating the remaining resistance. High priority target for immediate engagement." The fifth Apache attack run came from the south, with both helicopters engaging simultaneously to overwhelm any remaining anti-aircraft defenses. Maria watched as the northwestern section of the compound disappeared in a series of explosions, but she also noticed something that made her blood run cold. More fighters were arriving from outside the compound perimeter. "Reaper 2-1, be advised we have additional enemy forces approaching from the south," she reported, tracking the new threat through her damaged scope. "Estimate squad-sized element approximately 800 meters south of the compound and closing. They appeared to have heavy weapons. The reinforcements were arriving just as the helicopters were running low on ammunition and fuel. The timing couldn't have been the worst." But as she watched the approaching enemy reinforcements, Maria noticed something else that changed her entire perspective on the tactical situation. These weren't just random Taliban fighters responding to the sound of battle. They were moving in military formation, with proper spacing and fire team organization. More importantly, she could see heavy weapons among them: mortars, machine guns, and what looked like more anti-aircraft missiles. "Reaper Flight, this is Overwatch," she transmitted on the command frequency, addressing both Apache helicopters. "The approaching enemy force is substantial and well-equipped. Recommend you engage while they're still in the open before they can reach defensive positions." She was essentially asking the pilots to abandon close support for the SEALs in favor of engaging the reinforcements, but she knew that if those reinforcements reached the compound, the battle would be lost regardless. The decision was agonizing but clear. The reinforcements represented the greater long-term threat, but there were still enemy fighters in the compound who could overrun the SEALs' position in the time it took to engage the distant targets. She had to choose between certain death now or probable death later, and neither option offered much hope for survival. "Engage the reinforcements," she finally transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision she was making. "The compound targets are danger close to friendlies, but the reinforcements are in the open and vulnerable. Take them now while you can."
The two Apache helicopters danked away from the compound, their pilots acknowledging Maria's target designation with professional brevity. She watched through her scope as they lined up for what would be their final attack run before returning to base for fuel and ammunition. In approximately 10 minutes, she and the 8 SEALs would be entirely on their own against whatever enemy forces remained in the area. Through her damaged scope, she could see the Taliban reinforcements spreading out as they approached the compound, their leader apparently recognizing the threat posed by the circling helicopters. But they were still in relatively open terrain, and this would be the helicopter's best chance to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy force before they reached defensive positions. The final Apache attack was devastating in its precision and effect. Rockets and 30mm cannon fire swept through the reinforcement column like a scythe through wheat, destroying vehicles, weapons, and personnel in a display of American firepower that left smoking craters where organized military units had existed moments before. Maria watched through her scope as the Taliban reinforcement effort simply disintegrated under the aerial assault.
"Outstanding effect on target," she reported, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction as she watched the surviving enemy fighters fleeing back toward whatever positions they had come from. "Enemy reinforcements have been neutralized, multiple vehicles destroyed, heavy casualties observed among remaining personnel." But even as she spoke, she could see movement in the compound below. The remaining Taliban fighters had used the helicopter's focus on the reinforcements to improve their own positions, and she counted at least 15 muzzle flashes still active among the ruins. The immediate threat had been reduced but not eliminated, and now they were facing the final phase of this deadly engagement without air support. "Reaper Flight, this is Overwatch," she transmitted as the helicopters began their departure. "Thanks for the assist, we'll take it from here." It was another lie. She had no idea how they were going to take it from here with limited ammunition and overwhelming enemy numbers. But the pilots had done everything they could, and now it was up to the ground forces to finish what had been started. Her 23rd shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was attempting to move closer to the SEAL's position under cover of smoke from the burning compound buildings. But as she worked the bolt to chamber another round, she realized she was down to her last few cartridges. After that, she would only have her sidearm and whatever weapons she might be able to scavenge from enemy positions. "Groundhog 6, this is Overwatch," she transmitted to Morrison. "Air support is departing for resupply. It's just us now. What's your ammunition status?" She needed to know how much fight the SEALs had left in them, because the remaining Taliban fighters were certainly going to test their resolve in the coming minutes. Morrison's response was characteristically honest. "We're down to emergency reserves across the team, maybe 5 magazines total for 8 men, plus whatever's left in our current weapons. Tank's still hurting, but he's functional. Ghost has comms working intermittently. We can hold our current position for maybe 15 more minutes of sustained contact." 15 minutes. Maria did the mental mathematics and realized that even if everything went perfectly, they were still facing almost impossible odds. The remaining Taliban fighters were in defensive positions, they knew the terrain intimately, and they had numerical superiority. Most importantly, they knew that the Americans were almost out of ammunition and had no immediate prospect of resupply or reinforcement. Her 24th shot was aimed at what looked like an enemy sniper position in the compound's northern section. The bullet struck close enough to force the fighter to take cover, but she couldn't confirm a hit through her damaged scope. She was down to maybe 4 rounds now, and each one had to count for more than just suppressing enemy fire. That's when she heard something that made her heart race, the distinctive sound of rotor blades approaching from the east. But these weren't the familiar sounds of Apache attack helicopters returning to the fight. This was something different, the heavier, more powerful sound of transport aircraft. Someone was coming, but were they friends or enemies? "Groundhog 6, do you have any friendlies inbound?" she asked Morrison, hoping against hope that extraction or reinforcement was finally arriving. The timing would be perfect. Just as they were running out of ammunition and options, salvation would arrive from the sky. But Morrison's response crushed that hope. "Negative on friendly air assets. All air support has been recalled for refuel and rearm. Whatever you're hearing isn't ours." The approaching aircraft were either enemy reinforcements or neutral parties who had no interest in helping American forces. Either way, their tactical situation had just become significantly more complicated. Through her scope, she could see the remaining Taliban fighters in the compound also reacting to the sound of approaching aircraft. Some were taking cover, apparently as uncertain about the identity of the incoming aircraft as she was, but others were moving to positions where they could signal to the aircraft, suggesting that they might know something she didn't. Her 25th shot, one of her last, eliminated a Taliban fighter who was setting up what looked like an enemy signaling mirror to communicate with the approaching aircraft. If the incoming helicopters were enemy reinforcements, preventing communication between ground and air forces might buy precious time for some kind of miracle to occur. But as the aircraft's sound grew louder, Maria realized with growing certainty that her story was approaching its final chapter. She had done everything possible, used every skill she possessed, and made every sacrifice she could make. The 8 SEALs below were still alive, still fighting, still refusing to surrender despite impossible odds. If this was where her war ended, at least it would end with honor.
The approaching aircraft crested the eastern ridgeline, and Maria felt her heart skip a beat as she recognized the distinctive silhouette through her scope. They weren't Taliban reinforcements or neutral parties. They were American CH-47 Chinook helicopters. The heavy lift aircraft that meant extraction or massive reinforcement was finally at hand.
But who had sent them, and how had they known where to find the embattled American forces? Her radio crackled with a new voice, calm and professional. Groundhog 6, this is Rescue 11. We have been monitoring your situation and are inbound for immediate extraction. Pop smoke and prepare for emergency pickup in 30 seconds. The cavalry had arrived, but Maria knew that 30 seconds was an eternity when enemy fighters were still active in the area. Purple smoke, Morrison shouted, and Maria watched through her scope as fresh-colored smoke began billowing from the SEALs' position. But she also saw Taliban fighters emerging from cover, apparently determined to prevent the American extraction, even if it cost them their lives. This final phase was going to be the most dangerous yet. Her 26th shot, her next-to-last round, took down a Taliban fighter who was aiming an RPG at the incoming Chinook helicopter. The range was extreme, her scope was damaged, and she was firing from an exposed position under intense enemy fire. But somehow, the bullet found its mark. The RPG launcher tumbled down the rocky slope as its operator collapsed. The first Chinook flared for landing just behind the SEAL's position, its twin rotors creating a massive dust cloud that provided some concealment, but also made precision shooting nearly impossible. Maria could hear the aircraft's door gunners engaging targets with their mounted machine guns, laying down suppressive fire to protect the landing zone. But as the dust cloud expanded, Maria lost visual contact with both the SEALs and most of the remaining enemy positions. She was shooting blind now, forced to engage muzzle flashes and movement that she could barely see through the swirling dust and her damaged scope. Her last round eliminated what might have been an enemy fighter, but she couldn't be certain of anything in the chaos below. Overwatch, this is Groundhog 6, Morrison's voice came through the radio, barely audible over the sound of helicopter engines and gunfire. We're loading wounded first, then the rest of the team. What's your extraction plan? He was asking how she intended to get from her position on the ridgeline to the landing zone location, a distance of several hundred meters across ground that was still covered by enemy fire. I'll make my own way down, Maria replied, though she had no idea how she was going to accomplish that feat. Her position was still under fire, she was out of rifle ammunition, and the route to the landing zone was covered by at least a dozen enemy fighting positions. The truth was that she probably wasn't going to make it to the helicopter, but she wasn't going to burden the SEALs with that knowledge. She slung her empty rifle and drew her sidearm, a Mina Beretta pistol with 2 magazines, hardly adequate for fighting her way through multiple enemy positions. But it was what she had, and she had survived this long by making the best of whatever resources were available to her. The descent from her ridgeline position was a nightmare of loose rock, enemy fire, and pure desperation. Maria bounded from cover to cover using every piece of terrain that offered even momentary concealment from the Taliban fighters who were trying to prevent her escape. Bullets sparked off rocks around her, and she could hear the distinctive crack thump of near misses as she scrambled down the mountainside. Her first pistol shots were fired at a Taliban fighter who tried to intercept her halfway down the slope. The 9mm rounds weren't nearly as devastating as the .5 caliber bullets she had been firing all morning, but they were accurate enough at close range. The enemy fighter dropped, and Maria continued her desperate descent toward the landing zone. 30 seconds, the Chinook pilot announced over the radio. We need everyone on board in 30 seconds or we're going to take casualties from enemy fire. The helicopter was taking hits from Taliban fighters who were still active throughout the compound, and its armor could only protect against small arms fire for so long. Maria could see the helicopter now, its rear ramp lowered, and SEALs helping their wounded teammates aboard. She was still 50 meters away, with at least 2 enemy positions between her and safety. 50 meters might as well have been 50 miles when those meters were covered by hostile fire, but she had come too far to give up now. Her final sprint to the helicopter was a blur of gunfire, exhaustion, and pure determination. She fired her remaining pistol ammunition at enemy positions, not really aiming but trying to keep hostile heads down long enough for her to cover the last few meters to the aircraft. Bullets tugged at her equipment, struck the ground at her feet, and filled the air around her with the deadly song of combat. Strong hands pulled her aboard the Chinook just as the pilot began lifting off. She found herself lying on the aircraft's metal floor, gasping for breath while the SEALs checked her wounds and the door gunners continued engaging enemy positions below. Through the aircraft's open ramp, she could see the compound growing smaller as they gained altitude, the morning sun casting long shadows across a battlefield where 8 Americans had faced impossible odds and somehow survived. Outstanding work up there, Sergeant, Morrison said, offering him his hand.
I don't know how the hell you made some of those shots, but you saved all our lives today." Coming from a SEAL team leader, it was the highest praise she could have received. But as Maria looked back at the receding battlefield, she knew that she had been forever changed by what happened in that forgotten valley. She had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed, a capacity for sacrifice and courage that went far beyond what she had thought possible.
The flight back to Forward Operating Base Chapman passed in relative silence, broken only by the steady thrum of the Chinook's twin rotors and the occasional radio chatter from the crew. Maria sat against the aircraft's bulkhead, still processing what had just occurred in that remote Afghan valley. Around her, the SEALs were conducting their own quiet debriefing, checking on wounded teammates and beginning the mental transition from combat back to whatever passed for normal life in a war zone. Tank, despite his wounds, was conscious and talking, a good sign that his injuries, while serious, weren't life-threatening. Ghost had multiple cuts and bruises from the RPG explosions, but his communication equipment had saved his life by deflecting shrapnel that would have otherwise been fatal. The other team members showed the typical signs of intense combat: exhaustion, minor wounds, and the 1,000-yard stare that came from surviving something that should have killed them. Sergeant Vasquez, Lieutenant Commander Morrison, settled beside her, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had just lived through the impossible. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever provided terminal guidance for close air support before today?" His question was direct, professional, and Maria realized that he had probably figured out the truth during the helicopter attacks. She looked into his eyes and saw not accusation, but curiosity, the professional interest of one warrior trying to understand another. "No, sir. I've trained on the procedures, but I've never actually talked aircraft onto targets in a combat situation. Everything I did today was based on classroom instruction and field manuals." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Well, Sergeant, I don't know if you realize this, but you just conducted some of the most precise danger close fire missions I've ever witnessed. Those helicopter strikes were textbook perfect, and you were calling them in with a damaged scope while under direct enemy fire. That's not something you learn from field manuals." The conversation was interrupted by the crew chief announcing their approach to the base. Through the windows of the aircraft, Maria could see the familiar sight of Forward Operating Base Chapman spread out below, the concertina wire perimeters, the prefabricated buildings, the dust and organized chaos that defined American military operations in Afghanistan. It looked like paradise after the morning's events. The medical personnel were waiting for them as the Chinook touched down. Tank and Ghost were immediately loaded onto stretchers and wheeled toward the aid station, though both men were conscious and arguing with the medics about their treatment priorities. The remaining SEALs gathered their equipment and weapons, preparing for the inevitable debriefings and after-action reports that would follow any combat engagement. But before he left the helicopter, Morrison turned back to Maria one final time. "Sergeant, I'm going to be writing a detailed report about what happened today. That report is going to include a recommendation that you be considered for some significant recognition. What you did up there..." He paused, searching for the right words. "What you did up there saved 8 American lives. That's not something the Army forgets." Over the following weeks, as the paperwork and investigations ran their course, Maria learned more about the engagement that would come to be known as the Battle of Whiskey Valley. Intelligence reports revealed that the Taliban had been planning the ambush for months, using Abdul Rahman as bait to lure American Special Operations Forces into a carefully prepared killing ground. The compound had been fortified with multiple defensive positions, underground bunkers, and pre-positioned ammunition supplies. The enemy force had numbered at least 40 fighters, including experienced foreign jihadists who had brought military training and heavy weapons to the fight. By all military calculations, 8 SEALs should not have survived contact with such a large, well-prepared enemy force in disadvantageous terrain. The fact that they not only survived but completed their mission was attributed directly to Maria's precision fire and her unprecedented coordination of close air support.
The official after-action report, classified at the highest levels, documented 26 confirmed enemy killed in action, including Abdul Rahman and several of his senior lieutenants. The Taliban network in that region was effectively destroyed, and intelligence gathered from the compound led to follow-up operations that eliminated additional terrorist cells throughout the province. But the most significant outcome of the Battle of Whiskey Valley wasn't measured in enemy casualties or intelligence gathered. It was measured in the 8 American warriors who returned home alive, who would see their families again, who would continue serving their country because one sniper had refused to abandon her post when the odds became impossible. Maria's father had been right all those years ago when he taught her to shoot cans off fence posts in Texas. Shooting wasn't about the gun. It was about breathing, patience, and knowing yourself better than your enemy knew you. But he had left out one crucial element that Maria discovered on that Afghan mountainside. It was also about the willingness to sacrifice everything for people you barely knew simply because they wore the same uniform and served the same flag. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place 6 months later in the East Room of the White House, with Maria's family, the surviving SEALs, and senior military leadership in attendance. As the president placed the medal around her neck, Maria thought about that morning in Afghanistan and the series of decisions that had led her to this moment. She had made 26 confirmed shots under the most adverse conditions imaginable, but the shot that mattered most was the first one, the decision to stay in position and fight regardless of the odds. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez became the first female sniper to receive the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, she became a symbol of what American warriors were capable of when they refused to accept defeat. Her story would be told in training schools, written about in military journals, and remembered by every sniper who faced impossible odds in future conflicts. The SOS that echoed through Whiskey Valley that morning was answered not by rescue forces or reinforcements, but by one soldier's legendary shot and the courage to keep taking them until the job was done.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.